Welcome back. Now it's time to finally build our first project with a visual user interface. And actually, we'll build not one, but 3 beautiful projects in this section so that you can learn the basics of so-called DOM manipulation. So, up until this point, we have only learned about the language itself. But now we will take it to the next level and actually make JavaScript interact with real web pages. So, for the first time now, we will finally see a real project come to life. And so that's going to be a lot of fun and really exciting. Welcome to the first of 3 wonderful projects that we're going to build in this section. And let's get started right away. And here I have a working demo of the project that we're going to build over the next couple of videos. And this project is called Guess My Number, and I went with this kind of retro design, like inspired by the old 80s game, just to make it a bit more fun. So as the name says, the goal of this project is to simply guess a secret number, which is between 1 and 20. So here in this input, we can type a number, let's say 10, then we click check, and then here on the right side we get a message. In this case it says that our guess was too low. Also we can see that we started with a score of 20, and now after one failed guess it decreased to 19. So basically after each guess that we fail, the score decreases by 1. So let's try another one. It's still too low and our score decreased again. Let's try 18. And now it's too high, so we get this different message. And now it's correct. So you see that we get this correct number message, the screen turns green, and also we now have the high score here of 17. So a high score is another feature of this small application. Then, if we want to play again, we can simply click the again button, and it all resets everything except for the high score. So the high score is kept. And so if I'm quicker in this round, my high score will then become better. Let's start again at 10. So maybe I can do it faster. Well, I think I cannot. It's too high. And so my high score stays the same as it was before. Okay, so with this, I think you understood how this project works. So let's actually get to work. And as always, grab your starter files from the GitHub repository. I already have mine here. And then let's open up this folder. So that's this one. And let's start by taking a look at the files that we have here. First up, we have the prettier configuration. So exactly the one that we used in the editor setup section. And from now on, we will always use this configuration in every single project. Then we have an empty script. We have the CSS style, which you can take a look at if you're interested, and the same for the HTML. Now the HTML will actually be important because that's where we will find the class names of all of these elements that we're going to have to select to make this project work. But more about that later. And yeah, let's close up this sidebar and focus on our script here. So as you just saw, all of this interface here basically is implemented in HTML. So again, that is this document, okay? And this whole HTML document is made up of smaller HTML elements. For example, this message that we see here is in our HTML, this paragraph here with the message class. And so now in JavaScript, we can actually select this element based on this class. So a little bit like we can select elements in CSS, we can do the same in JavaScript. And if you're not at all familiar with HTML and CSS, then please watch the HTML and CSS crash course that is in the previous section. Anyway, before we learn what the DOM and DOM manipulation actually are, Let's quickly learn an easy way of selecting an element like this in JavaScript. And this is how it works. We write document.querySelector. So this query selector is basically a method that's available on the document object. And more about that later. Now into this method, we need to pass in a selector. And again, this selector is exactly the same selector that we would use in CSS. So we pass in a string, and we want to select the element with the class name of message. And so we need to write a dot and then message. Again, this is exactly how we would select the same element using CSS, right? Now, if it was an ID instead of a class, we would use the hash, right? But in this case, it is really a class, and so let's use the dot. And now we can quickly take a look at the result of this selection here using the console. And remember that we set up the CL snippet in the editor setup section. So I just write CL, and then I get console.log automatically here. Now, in case you skipped that section, you can always go back and see how I did that, or you can just write a console.log manually. So I give it a save, and now I do another thing that we learned in the editor setup section, which is to open up this project using the live server, right? So let's open up the terminal here by clicking New Terminal. Okay, let's clear it using Command K. And again, we learned how to do all of this in the editor setup section. So if you skip that, then please go back and watch that one first. Anyway, we see that we're already in the folder. So guess my number, that's exactly the folder. And now all we need to do is to type live server, hit enter, and then it will open up a new tab in our browser. So this is the demo here that I'm going to keep on the right side, and then here on the left side is the actual project that we are building. Of course, nothing works yet, but let's just open up the console. So inspect console, give it some more space. And so indeed, we actually already have the P element here selected. So that's what we did here. So document.querySelector message. And so in the console, we then get basically this entire element. And as we hover over it, it actually even gets selected here on the page. Great. So this is the first basically DOM manipulation that you did. Great job. Now this element here itself is not really that useful. So instead, let's actually get this text. So this start guessing here. And we can do that simple enough. All we have to do is another dot and then text content. So this part here first selects the element. And so the result of this query selector method is going to be an element. And then on that element, we can read the text content property. And so that's why we use another dot here. And remember, when we have multiple dot operators, they are executed from left to right. And so first this operation here is done, then this selected here basically will get replaced with the element itself. And then on that element, we can read the text content property using another dot. So let's give it a save. This will then reload automatically. And yes, now we get start guessing, which is really just the text content of this element. Great. So now we kind of know how to establish this connection between our code and the user interface. So in other words, the HTML document that's being displayed in the browser. So this was a quick introduction to the DOM and how to select an element. But what is the DOM actually? And what is DOM manipulation, which is the big topic of this section? Well, let's find out in the next video. So in this section, we're going to make JavaScript interact with a web page for the very first time. And the technical term for that is doing DOM manipulation. Now, in the last lecture, you already selected an element from a page. And what that means is that you kind of interacted with the DOM already. So in this lecture, let's learn what the DOM actually is and how it works. So what is the DOM actually? Well, DOM stands for Document Object Model, and it is basically a structured representation of HTML documents. The DOM allows us to use JavaScript to access HTML elements and styles in order to manipulate them. For example, we will be able to change text, to change HTML attributes, and also to change CSS styles from our JavaScript. So we can say that the DOM is basically a connection point between HTML documents and JavaScript code. Now, the DOM is automatically created by the browser as soon as the HTML page loads, and it's stored in a tree structure like this one. In this tree, each HTML element is one object. And so let's now take a look at this DOM structure in a little bit more detail. And to illustrate this, here is a very simple HTML document, and here is what the DOM tree corresponding to this HTML looks like. So, as I already mentioned, this is a tree structure, which looks a bit like a family tree, right? And actually, we use the terms child element, parent element, sibling element, and so on when we talk about the DOM tree and DOM manipulation. Anyway, as you can see, for each element in the HTML, there is one element node in the DOM tree, and we can access and interact with each of these nodes using JavaScript. Okay, so the DOM always starts with the document object right at the very top. And document is a special object that we have access to in JavaScript. And this object serves as an entry point into the DOM. Remember how you used document.querySelector in the last lecture to select an element? So that means that the querySelector method is available on the document object. And so that's why we say that document is the entry point to the DOM, because we need it to start selecting elements. Alright, then the first child element of document is usually the HTML element, because that's usually the root element in all HTML documents. Next, HTML usually has two child elements, head and body. And so of course, you can also find them here in the DOM tree. In the HTML, they are adjacent elements, and so they are siblings in our DOM as well. Then, as we keep going deeper into the nested HTML structure, we keep adding more and more children to the DOM tree. So inside head and body, you have more child elements, and the two sections in the body even have child elements themselves. And from there, it goes even deeper, because the first paragraph also has a child, which is this link element here. And with that, finally, we have all our HTML elements in the DOM tree. But the DOM tree actually has more than just element nodes. It also has nodes for all the text itself, comments, and other stuff. Because basically, the rule is that whatever is in the HTML document also has to be in the DOM. And so, as you see, the DOM really is a complete representation of the HTML document, so that we can manipulate it in complex ways. And with this, you should now have a good overview of how the DOM works and what it looks like. But before we finish, I need to clarify something that many beginners find confusing. So, many people believe that the DOM and all the methods and properties that we can use to manipulate the DOM, such as document.querySelector and lots of other stuff, are actually part of JavaScript. However, this is not the case. Remember that JavaScript is actually just a dialect of the ECMAScript specification, and all this DOM-related stuff is simply not in there. So up until this point, we have only used the JavaScript language itself. But starting in this section, we will also use JavaScript in the browser. I mean, sure, we have used Google Chrome to run our code in the developer console, but that's not what I mean here. What I mean is to manipulate web pages that are actually displayed and rendered in the browser, just like any normal website that you know. Okay, but now you might ask, if the DOM is not a part of the JavaScript language, then how does this all work? Well, the DOM and DOM methods are actually part of something called the web APIs. So the web APIs are like libraries that browsers implement and that we can access from our JavaScript code. And API stands for Application Programming Interface, but more about that later. For now, what you need to know is that web APIs are basically libraries that are also written in JavaScript and that are automatically available for us to use. So all this happens behind the scenes. We don't have to import or do anything, okay? And there is actually an official DOM specification that browsers implement, which is the reason why DOM manipulation works the same in all browsers. Now, besides the DOM, there are actually a ton more web APIs, such as timers, the fetch API, and many more. Again, we will learn a lot more about this later on. For now, let's finally start our project and do some DOM manipulation in practice. Now that we have a better understanding of what DOM and DOM manipulation are, let's now actually select and manipulate some more elements. So in the previous lecture, we already selected this message element here by using query selector, right? Then we also got the text content from the selected element. But besides getting the text content, we can also set the content of the element. So let's do that. So instead of start guessing, let's say like correct number. So that's actually going to be like the winning phrase. So again, we select the element. So query selector. And the same selector. So again, the element with the class of message. And then again, text content. So that's exactly the same as here. Okay. Now here, we actually then logged the result to the console so that we could see it. But here, we will actually set this content to something else. And we do that by writing equal and then whatever we want the new content to be. So let's say correct number. And I'm also going to add here the party emoji. But again, you don't need to do that. It's just to improve the design of the app a little bit, basically. And so now if I save this, it should immediately change this text content here. So watch as I save now. And nothing happened, but that's because I'm here on the demo version. So I need the real one. And so here you see now correct number. Great, so that worked. And down here we still have to start guessing because that's what the content of the element used to be before. So in this line, we started by reading the content of the element. And so at the beginning, it was still start guessing because that's what is written here in the HTML element in the beginning, right? Then in the next line, we changed it. And now if we would attempt to read it again, it should then be this new content that we said before. So let's copy and paste this line here really quick, give it a save. And so now you see that, of course, after changing the text content, when we then read it, it will be this new content. So exactly what we have now here. Okay, that makes sense. And so what we did here is really already DOM manipulation. Because in fact, here we manipulated the text content of one of the DOM nodes. So essentially this element here. So let's now do the same with this secret number and also the score. So both of these values are basically stored in an element. So let's take a look at the HTML. And so this is what I was telling you in the beginning, that we would need this HTML to basically get the class names of all the elements that we are interested in. So this secret number here, so this here is basically this div element here with the class number. And then the score, as you see here down here from this 20, this is where this 20 is. And in this case, it is this span element with the class score. So now let's go ahead and select the elements with the class number and score. Okay, so that's exactly what we did before. So query selector with the class number. And just to experiment some more with this, let's actually set it to something. Let's say 13. And then document dot query selector dot score. And by the way, there are also other ways of selecting elements, but we will talk about them in one of the next projects. And let's set this element also to another value. Oh, and actually I'm forgetting the text content here. So we cannot set the entire element because the element has way more than just the content. So I really have to say that the text content should be 13. So text content. And now as I reload this, this should be 13 and this 20. Let's actually set this to another number. Otherwise we wouldn't see it changing. And indeed, we get 13 and 10 now. Great, that's amazing. So doing some great DOM manipulation here. And now let's move on and do the same actually with this input field. So an input field, as the name says, is where we can input some data. And so actually we can also get the data from here, and we can of course also set it. So let's just see how that works, and it's very similar. So as always, we start by selecting the element. And now we need to get the class name of this element. And so that is, it's right here. So it has the class of guess. And as I said, it's an input element. So again, dot, which is the class selector, and then the name of the class, which is guess. And here we got this error because the query selector method expects at least one argument. And as we went to the HTML file, it then saved this JavaScript file, but we didn't have any string here, so any parameter yet. So that's why we got that error. And now if we want to get the value, which right now is actually empty, but if we want to get that, now this time we read the value property. And so let's log that to the console actually. So again, using the CL snippet. And if we reload this now, yeah, we just get this like empty value here because there is really nothing in there. Okay, but the big difference is that with an input field, to get the actual value, we use the value property. And we can of course also use it to set a value. So to manipulate this element. So dot value equals 23. Give it a save. And now we see 23 here. So as if we had written it ourselves. So we can delete it here just like any input field. But instead of us writing the number, it was JavaScript who wrote the 23 here for us simply by executing this code here. And to make this line of work here actually and to make this line of code here actually work, we can move it below the one where we're setting the value. So in VS Code, let's use Alt and the down arrow to move this line down. And then we should expect to see 23 here in the console instead of this empty line. And indeed, now we first write 23 here to this input field, and then afterwards we read it, and then the value is indeed 23. Great. But now what if we actually wanted to get this number here, for example, to log it to the console whenever we clicked on this button? Well, that's taking it to a whole new level. And so handling the click of a button is what we're going to learn in the next video. See you there soon. Let's now make our application actually do something when we click on the check button. So this is going to be the first time that our code reacts to something that happens in the DOM. And for that, we need to use an event listener. Now, an event is something that happens on the page. For example, a mouse click, or a mouse moving, or a key press, or many other events. Then, with an event listener, we can wait for a certain event to happen and then react to it. So let's try it out now. And let's actually start by getting rid of this code, because this has actually nothing yet to do with the application. But now we will actually start developing the application step by step. Anyway, in order to listen for events, we first need to select the element where the event should happen. And in this case, we want to listen to the event on this button element here. So this check button, because this is where the click that we're interested in will happen. So when we click on this button, something should happen. So let's select that button element. So query selector. And then once more, we need to go ahead and grab the class name of this button. And so here it is. Now here we actually have two class names. We have button and check, but the button class here is the more generic one, which also applies to this other button, this again button here. So the class that we are interested in is just the check class. So again, the dot for the class selector and then check. And so this will select the button element itself. So just as before, this here will then return an element. And now on that element, we can call the add event listener method. So add event listener. And this is a method. And so we need to call it once more using the parentheses. Now, there are actually multiple ways to listen for events in JavaScript, but using this add event listener method is the best one and also the most used one. Okay, now into this add event listener method, we first need to pass in the type of the event. And in this case, it's just a simple click. So the name of the event is actually click. And so that is the first argument that we pass here into this function. But now we actually need to tell the event listener what to do. So basically, we need to specify the reaction to the click event. And we do that by defining a function. And that function will contain exactly the code that should be executed whenever this click event happens on this check button. And that function is going to be called the event handler. Now, this method, this add event listener method here, is a special kind of function. That's because as a second argument, it expects this event handler function that we just talked about. So again, here as a second argument, we now need to pass in a function value as an argument. And that's probably quite confusing, I know, but that's no problem at this point. This will make more sense as we do this over and over again. For now, just remember what you learned in the fundamentals section, which is that a function is also just a value. And if a function is just a value, then we can also pass it into another function as an argument, just like any other value, like a string or a number. So let's create that function here. And just like before, we do that writing function, and then the curly braces for the function body. Okay, and now all we have to do is to specify what should happen. And to start, what we want to happen is to simply log to the console the value that is here in this input field. So console.log document.querySelector, and actually we already have this code up there, but let's just write it again. So remember that this element here has the class guess, and then from this element we take the value. Okay, and that's it. So let's save it, let's test it, and then we will just go over this again. So I will write 9, and now when I click this button, this 9 should appear down here in the console. And it does. Okay, great. Great job. So let's quickly go over this again. So we selected this button here using query selector, and then we used the add event listener method on that element to attach an event handler. And that event handler is this function here. Okay, so this is again just a function expression. So it's similar to when we do just, for example, this, and then just log something to the console. So this is also just a function value, right? And then we can assign that to a variable, and then we call all of this a function expression. You remember that, right? And so here, basically, we did the exact same thing. So we wrote here a function that has a similar format as this. We simply did not assign it to any variable. Instead, we passed it directly here into the add event listener method. So as a first argument, we had the name of the event that we're listening for, which is a click. And then as a second argument, we have this function value. And this function simply contains the code that we want to execute whenever the event happens. Also, note that we do not call this function here anywhere, right? We only define the function here and then pass it into the event handler. But it is the JavaScript engine who will call this function as soon as the event happens. Okay, that's important to understand. So again, this function will not be called immediately once this script here is executed. This function will only be called as soon as the event happens. And you can also see that here in the code because, well, we don't call the function anywhere using the parentheses, right? And so, yeah, again, we're just really passing it into the add event listener function. So this works just fine now. Let's try here another number. So now we get 99. And of course, we can also do some DOM manipulation here. For example, let's just, grab this piece of code here and paste it here as well, give it a save. And now when I click this here, not only the value from this input field will get logged to the console, but also this message here will change. So the text content of this element. So you see, correct number and now 22. Now, of course, this has nothing to do with the game yet. So I just wanted to show you that, but let me get rid of this actually. But now let's actually start to slowly build up the game. So in the real game, when we click on this button here, of course, this number from this input field will have to get retrieved. So let's start with that. And so we already did this here, but instead of just logging it to the console, let's actually save it into a variable. So const guess and then equal this. Okay. And now let's log it to the console just so we see it. And so this should now do the exact same thing, but we first stored that value into a variable and then we log it afterwards. All right. Now remember how I said in the fundamentals section that usually whenever we get something from the user interface, for example from an input field, it usually always is a string. So let me show that to you here now. So again, we use the type of operator that we already learned before. And now when I put this here, we indeed get a string. However, we will eventually have to compare this number here with a randomly generated number. So that's going to be basically the secret number that we will have to guess. And so if we want to compare numbers with numbers, we need to first convert this string to a number. So let's do that here using the number function that we also already used before. And so now let's print both here. So the guess and then the type. And now we get 5. And now it's also here in purple. And we get that it's a number. And now let's start to implement the game logic here a little bit. But just the simplest case, which is the case that there's actually no guess. So usually in an application like this, which has an input value from the user, the first thing to do is to check if there actually is a value. And if there is no value, well, then we can print something to the console as a response. So we can say if there is no guess. And let me actually show you how that would look like. So if I click on the button now, indeed we get 0. And 0 is a falsy value. Okay, and so guess here in this logical context of the if-else statement will be false. So that's what we learned in the fundamentals section, right? So any value that is here in this condition part will always get evaluated to a Boolean. And so since this guess is 0 in this case, and 0 is a falsy value, it will be converted to false. But we want something to happen whenever this is false. And so here we actually want a true value, right? And so we simply use the negation operator to then invert this Boolean from false to true. And so in this case, we can then print some sort of message here to our message field or message element. And so let me again go ahead and copy it from here because we already did that before. So let's say no number, and then as always an emoji here. Let's do this one, or actually it's more like forbidden. So that's the one I used. Let's save it. And so now whenever I click this button, let's check it, then indeed we get no number. Okay? So again, this works because 0 is falsy, and so guess here is false now. But then we use the not operator to convert it to true, and like this, we can then make this block of code execute. Because remember, it only executes whenever this whole condition here is true. Okay, and so with this, we implemented the first scenario. So again, usually the first scenario is always to assume that there is actually no input. And then we need to respond to that somehow. Now in the next video, we will then implement all the other scenarios. For example, where this guess here is actually correct. So where it's equal to the secret number. So we will have to generate that secret number then and compare it to the guess. But let's leave that to the next video. Let's now continue building our game and actually implement the game logic itself. And with game logic, I basically mean implementing the way how the game works. So we need to implement what happens when the guess is correct. So when it's equal to the secret number. We also need to implement what happens when the guess is too low or when it's too high. So basically we have these three scenarios. And to start, we actually need to define that secret number. Otherwise, there's nothing which we can compare the guess to, right? Now, where do you think we should define that secret number? Should we do it inside of this button handler, or should we do it outside? Well, the answer is that we should do it outside, because we only want that secret number to be defined once. So only when we start the application. And so that's out here, outside of the handler function. If we define the secret number inside this handler function, then on each click, we would get a new secret number. And so then the game would make no sense at all, right? We just need one number, which we can then compare to each of the guesses here on each click. So let's define the number. So I'm just going to call it number here. And now we need a random number between 1 and 20. And this is actually pretty similar to the dice roll that we did earlier in the fundamentals section. So we use math.random. And so math is basically an object that JavaScript gives us. And on there, we have a lot of different methods. And random is one of them. And it gives us a number between 0 and 1. So let me show that to you. So whenever I run this, it will give me a new number. And it's always different from the one before. Now, if I want a number between 1 and 20, I will start by multiplying this by 20. And so now we have this decimal number here basically ranging between 0 and 20. But all this decimal here is just noise. So let's remove that. And for that, we use math.trunc. And I'm doing all of this here in the console so you can see how this is building up. Okay. And so now I have a number which goes from 0 to 19. Because the result of this here will never really include the number 20. It might only include like 19.999999. But now we're cutting off that decimal part. And so we are now left with a number between 0 and 19. And so to elevate it to between 1 and 20, all we have to do is to add 1 here. And with this, we make sure that the number is always between these two boundaries. So let's grab this now. So now that it works, and put it here. And with this, we have our secret number. Now in the real game, the number will obviously be hidden, so behind this question mark. But now, since we are still in development, let's actually display the number here so that we can then test our game logic as we develop it. So let's select that number. And I think, again, we already did it before, but let's do it here anyway again. Let's just, so the class name is number. And then remember, we use text content, and to set it, we simply use the equal sign. And now, what do we put here? Well, just the number that we just calculated. And now, as I save it, watch what happens. Here we now have our random number. And as I reload the page, you will see different random numbers appearing. And again, for you, of course, it will be different numbers. And you see here 20, which is actually the maximum. So this means that 20 is indeed included in our range here. Just to check if it's all right. So if we don't see any weird numbers, but it all looks okay to me. And so let's now move on and actually compare the secret number to the user's guess. So here we already have the condition, if there is no guess, then just print to the message element that there is no number. So let's again check that. And indeed, it works. But now, what if there actually is a guess? So let's say else if, and now we will actually check if the guess is the same as the secret number. And since I'm always saying secret number, let's actually change the variable name. So double click to select it, and then I can double click on all of the instances. So that's this one and this one. So that's a nice VS Code trick. And so now I have these 3 cursors. So let's delete all of that. Secret number. So the code works the same now, but the variable name makes a little bit more sense. So let's create a code block here. And now we need to specify what happens when the guess is correct. So again, when the guess is the same as the secret number. That's essentially what the guess being correct means, right? So what should happen then is that the correct number message should be displayed. So let's copy that and put that here. And for now, that's actually it. So I'll just give it a save now. And so let's actually test this. So 5, which of course is different. And then in the future, we will want a message here saying that the number is too high. So we're going to do that in a second. But now let's just put the correct number here. And indeed, we now get correct number. So that's exactly what we defined here in this else if block. All right. So I hope all of it makes sense. And now let's work on that scenario that I just mentioned, which is when the guess is greater than the number. So you see that here in this big if-else if statement, we are covering all the different scenarios that might happen here to this number. So the first one was that there is no number at all, right? Then we checked if it's equal to the secret number, And now we will check if it's greater. So if the guess is greater than the secret number. And then what should happen? Well, let's again select the message dot text content. And then let's say too high. So the guess is too high now. And again, adding an emoji here. So I want this graph here. Okay. And now also, since we are working on this, let's account for the last situation or the last scenario as well, which is that the guess is lower than the secret number. So guess below secret number. And with this, we covered all the scenarios. Let's just copy this one now. Too low. And now we're using the adder graph here. Give it a save and let's test it. So right now we know that it's a 3. So let's try 12. And so now we should see too high. And yes, it works. Now let's test 1, which is too low, and it works again. And now let's test 3, which is correct. And indeed it is. Great. So that's working already. Now let's move on to the next step, which is to work with the score here. So remember that each time that we guess a wrong number, our score should decrease. So let me show that here to you again. So let's say 5 and see how it starts at 20, just like in our code. But now as I check wrong, so it's too high, and now the score decreased to 19. So let me check another one. And so now you see that my number goes down each time that I do a wrong guess. And so let's implement that in our code here as well. So as you see here, we start with a score of 20. And now in these two scenarios where the guess is wrong, so here where it's above and here where it's below, we want to decrease that score by 1, right? Because again, each time that there is a wrong guess, the score should decrease by 1. So how should we do that? And I can think of 2 ways of doing that. The first way is to read the score from here, then decrease it by 1, and then print it here again. So that would be the first way of doing it, but there is a better way. And the better way is to actually create a variable for the score in the code and then update that variable. So basically to decrease that variable and then display the value of that variable here in this score label. And by doing that, we have our data also in the code and not just on the DOM. And so that's always a very good thing to do. So let me do that now, and then I will explain it a little bit better. So I'm going to do that right here after the secret number. So const score, and as you already know, we start with 20. And so that's our initial score, so the value that we set to this variable. And actually this should be a let, because we will then decrease that value, remember? And so it cannot be a const, because a constant is immutable. Okay, and now here, let's go back to the wrong guess scenario, or scenarios, because it's this one and this one. And then all we do is to decrease the score. So score equal score minus 1. And maybe you already know, or hopefully you do, that this is the same as writing score minus minus. All right, so we decreased the score, and then all we have to do is to display that score here in this element. So once again, we already did that, so no need to repeat. So it's this one here. So we select the element with the class of score, and then as the text content, we give the score. All right, and that's it. Now we just need the same code also in the other wrong scenario. So where the guess is below the secret number. So I'm just copying this code and putting it here. Give it a save. And before testing it, let me again explain what we just did here. So as I said, we could have also stored this score basically in the DOM. And to do that, we would always just read this value from here. So right from the DOM, then we could decrease that value and then write it back here to the DOM. But then we would not have that value in our code. So essentially, our application would have no way of knowing that score at all points. And so it's always good to keep a variable which actually holds the data in our code and not just rely on the DOM to hold our data. All right. And this variable here can also be called a state variable because this score is part of the so-called application state, which is basically all the data that is relevant to the application. And we could say that this 17, so the secret number, is also part of the state of our application. All right. And so we want all the data always to be available somewhere in our code and not just in the DOM. Okay. So always keep that in mind. And so that is why we implemented the solution like this. So whenever there's a wrong guess, we just take the score that we already have in our code, then we decrease it by 1, and then we display that new score right here. So let's reload. Let's say 17, and watch what happens to our score now. And indeed, it decreased to 19, and our number is too high. And when I click again now, you see it decreasing even more. Now let's try with a lower number. So too low, and our score decreased again. And actually, let's keep going. So let's keep clicking here and watch what happens. So I'm clicking over and over on the same button here, and our score keeps going down, and eventually we reach 0. And at this point, we should basically lose the game, right? But as you see here, nothing, of course, happens. And we can keep clicking here and go until infinity, and our program will, of course, not care, because our program obviously has no idea of losing or of winning the game, right? It is completely on us to write all that logic. So basically what this means is that all of this checking here, so doing all this here, should only happen whenever the score is still above 0. And then when the score is actually 0, then we should get some kind of message here saying that we lost the game. So let's quickly do that here inside of this scenario. So basically we need another if statement here inside this already else if block. And that's of course not a problem at all. We can perfectly have one if inside of the other. So what I was just saying is that this here, all of this, should basically only happen while the score is still above 0. So let's do that. So if score is above 0, only then do all of this. All right. And now else, so basically if it is 0, then we want to display another message. So we want to say, you lost the game with some losing emoji. So I'm going to use this one here. So that's an explosion, I believe. So let's test that now. And we only implemented this for when the guess is above the secret number. So let's now use 12. It's too high. And now let's keep going to test what happens. So we are approaching it now. And now we lost the game. But actually I could click twice as my score was already 0. So try this for yourself. I will just reload here and again put a number that is above. So now the score is 1, and as I click, we should get the message, "You lost the game." So let's try. And it didn't happen yet. And it did not happen because the score was indeed still greater than 0 here, right? So we need to change that to greater than 1, okay? So again, a larger number. Now I get 1, and if I click, now you lost the game. And all we need to do is to then update the score to 0 here. So let's just copy this, write 0, and then before we test it, we can actually copy the same code to this other scenario. Now, as you can see, we are creating a lot of duplicate code, and we will fix that by the end of this project. But for now, let's just keep working on this. And the only thing that really changes here is this message. So you see that here is some potential to eliminate duplicate code. But again, we will take care later of that. For now, let's just make it work. Okay, and with this, I think we're actually finished. Let's just test it. So 5 is too low. So let's keep going down. And you lost the game. Great. Now let's test a larger number. And I keep clicking here. And now we lost the game too. Great. So our game logic is already working, and actually the game itself is also kind of working already. There's just two things that are missing here, which is the high score and this play again button. But before implementing that functionality, in the next video, we're going to talk a little bit about CSS and how we can manipulate styles using JavaScript. So the DOM actually also includes CSS styles. And so with DOM manipulation, we can also change styles. So let's try that out now. And what I want to do here is to change the background of this entire page here to a green color whenever the player guesses the right number. So when the player wins the game. And we will also make this number here wider than. So let me just demonstrate that here. So let's quickly win this game here. 17. And so you see, we want this green background and also this number here being wider. And for that, of course, we need to manipulate the styles of this page. So the CSS. Okay, so that should happen here in this scenario where the player wins the game. So where the guess is equal to the secret number. And actually, let's add some comments here to make this code a little bit easier to understand. So this one, when player wins. This first one is when there is no input. This is when guess is too high. And this one here is when guess is too low. So this now at least looks a little bit nicer. But anyway, let's now learn how to manipulate CSS styles. So we want to manipulate the style of this whole page. And so what we need to do is to select the whole body of this page first. Okay, so the body is basically this entire visible part of the website. So it's basically this whole element. All right. So as always, we need to start by selecting the element that we want to manipulate. So document.querySelector and then the selector. And now it's just the body element. So there's no dot because that's for classes. It's just really the element name. And since there's only one body, it's going to work just fine. So here we select the body And now we want to change the CSS style. So here we need to write style. So we access basically the style property of this element, and then another dot, and then the name of the property that we want to change. And in this case, it is the background color. So background. And in CSS, we write the background color like this. Background dash color, right? However, in JavaScript, that's not allowed. And so in JavaScript, all these property names that have two words, like background color, will simply adopt the camel case notation that I already explained you before and that we've been using all the time. So instead of background dash color, it's going to be background uppercase C for color like this. And the same rule applies to all the other property names that have multiple words. So style.background color, and now we set it to something. And let's get the actual color from our CSS. So you see that background color here is the one that we're trying to define, and we will specify it to this color value. So this is a standard RBG value in hexadecimal. And so we set it equal to, then we must write a string, and then the value we want to set it to. So just like before, to set anything on the DOM, we simply use the equal sign. So we have all of this, so the background color property on the style property, and we want to set it to this value. And so we set it equal to the value, okay? So that's one part. And now let's also increase the width of this number here, okay? And that's important because I want to show you something there. So document.querySelector, and that is the element with the class of number. And again, we want to change the style. So .style.width. And then again, we need to specify a string. So whenever we are manipulating a style, we always need to specify a string. We cannot just write like a number, like 30. It has to be a string, and in there we need a unit. And now I already closed the file, so let's open it up again. And the number that I'm looking for currently has a width of 15 rem. And now I want to double it, so 30 rem. So 30 rem. And again, it needs to be inside of a string. I cannot just write 30 rem or 30, so just a number. That would not work. We have to specify a string, which in this case contains the number plus the unit. So the same would be for percentages or pixels or whatever unit we use in CSS. Okay, give it a save now. And now let's actually try the correct number right away. So 12. And yes, it worked. Let's actually get rid of the console here. Then the page looks a bit nicer. And we can also, by the way, get rid of the terminal here in VS Code, because even if we close this panel here, this process will still keep running. The only way we stop this process from running is by hitting here this trash can, which will kill the terminal, or by hitting Control C. So let's close it, because this takes up too much space. But yeah, so this worked just fine. Now these styles are actually set as inline styles. So of course we are not changing the CSS file or anything like that. And let me just show that to you. So actually I will need back the dev tools here. Make it a bit larger now just to show it to you. And so indeed, it is an inline style. So a style that is applied directly in the HTML using this style attribute. And the same is going to be true for the body. Exactly. So we see here, this is the background color that we just applied. All right. So of course, not changing the CSS file or anything like that. Okay. And that's it actually. That's really the fundamentals of manipulating styles in CSS. The most important thing to remember is to use the style property, and then on there is where we specify the CSS property. And we need to specify that property in the camel case notation in case there is 2 words. And then the value always needs to be a string. So that's all you need to know in order to change styles like we just did here. Awesome. We're doing great progress in this project, and I hope that you're enjoying it so far and that you find it a lot of fun to be able to manipulate a web page like this. Anyway, in the next video, we will implement this reset button here, basically, where we can play the game again. And so I hope to see you there soon. So as I just said in the last video, let's now implement the functionality of playing the game again. And actually, I will leave that as a challenge for you, because this is already a great time for you to practice what you've been learning in this section. Now, before I give you the challenge, we first need to fix something here, which is that we should actually hide, of course, this secret number. So right now, as we load the page, the number gets visible. But instead, that should, of course, not happen. So we don't want this here, right? So this is where we set the text content of the number to the secret number. Instead, we want this to happen when the player actually guesses the correct number. So let's just cut it from here and move it to the situation where the player wins, which is here. So we display correct number, and then we also display the secret number. And so now you see that we're back to having the question mark. And so let's start guessing. So 10, that's too low. 15, that's too high. And now it's a real game because now we no longer know about the secret number. And 12 is correct. And so now our 12 is also visible here. And the high score, by the way, is also working. Let's just reload the page and do that again. So 10 is too low. 15, 18 is too high, so 17 maybe. So it's gotta be 16, right? I thought I tried. Oh, okay. I did something wrong. So 13, so it's gotta be 14. And yes, indeed. So the game itself is really working. And so now it's time to implement the functionality of this again button, which will basically reset here this entire interface. So let's go to the challenge I have for you here. And so as I just said, the challenge is to implement the game reset functionality so that the player can basically play again. And then here I'm giving you all the steps to implement this functionality in order to make it a little bit easier and not too overwhelming. Now, if you don't want the steps, then just pause the video now and try to implement it on your own. But probably at this point, it's better to get a step-by-step recipe of what you need to do. So first, select the element with the again class, and then attach a click event handler. So that's exactly what we did before with this button. And so now I want you to do the same with the again button. And try to see if you can remember how to do that instead of copying it from this other button. Then, once you have that event handler attached, in that function, restore the initial values of the score and of the number variables. So that are our two state variables of the application, basically. Remember? So the variable that holds the score and the variable that holds the secret number. So this here should actually be secret number. All right. Then also restore the initial conditions of the message, the number, and the score, and also of the guess input field. So basically when we click here, this here should be empty again. Here we should see the beginning message. Here the score should be back to 20. And here also should be the question mark as it was before. And then to finish, of course, also restore the original background color and the width of this number here. Okay, so just take a couple of minutes and try to do this, and I see you in a second. All right, so hopefully you managed to do this. Now it's my turn of doing the work. So we start, as I said, with selecting the button. So document.querySelector, and the class is again. So just showing that to you. So yeah, here it is. So that is the button. And then add event listener. And I'm just using autocomplete here because that's how developers do it. Then remember, the name of the event is a click. And then we need to specify a function. So this is our handler function, right? And by the way, we also say that this is an anonymous function because it doesn't have a name. So remember how I said before that usually we assign these function expressions to a variable, right? And then the function gets a name. But in this case, well, there is really no name for this function. We didn't call it anything, right? And so it's just an anonymous handler function. Anyway, let's now go here to step number 2. And so what we need to do here is to restore the initial values of the score and the secret number. So the score at the beginning of the game should always be 20, right? And then we also need a new secret number. So let's just get that from up here. So we don't need to calculate this over again. So we need just basically to reassign the value to secret number. So doing this same calculation here again. Now, if we want to reassign a value to this number, it cannot be a constant, right? And so we need to use a let here. So let's just copy this. And again, without the let, because we don't want to create a new secret number variable. All we want to do when a new game starts is to create a new secret number and then reassign the variable. So I'm just copying what I have selected here. And then down here is where I reassign this value to secret number. Okay. Next up, I want to restore the initial conditions of message, number, score, and the guess input field. So let's again copy this. So here, the string is start guessing. And we basically can get this from the HTML if we want. So this is the initial condition of the message, right? Then we also want to change the score. So let's just grab it from here. And that should be 20. Or actually, we can just set it to score. So to this variable, because that also already holds the number 20. And so that's a bit better than to repeat the same value. So instead, we are just referencing it here. Not 20, of course, it is score. Yeah, that was a silly mistake. Next up, we also want to change the number. So that's going to be this. So number, and set this one to the question mark. And finally, we also want to change the value that's here to empty. So let's copy that as well. So here is where we select that. Or actually even better, because we already set the value before. So document.querySelector, selecting the element with the guess class, and then we can simply set the value just as we did before to anything. And here, what we want to set it to is just to the empty string. So basically to nothing, because that's the empty value here. Remember that the value of an input is always a string. And so the empty string is basically the absence of any value here. Okay, and now to finish, all we need to do is to restore the background and the width of the number. So basically what we did in the last lecture, but redo it once we start a new game. So I'm just copying it here. and then paste it down here. Here, the number is 222, so this dark gray, and here it's 15 rem. Okay, and with this, we should have restored all the initial conditions, which will then make it possible to play the game again without reloading the browser. And that's going to be important later once we implement the high score, because then we will be able to play over and over again without reloading the page, which will then allow us to preserve this high score here throughout the different rounds. So let's just play the game so that we can finish it and play again. So that's too low. 15, 12, 13. Well, we can also use these buttons here, by the way. And we get the correct number. So that's nothing new. But now when I click again, everything should be restored. So let's see. And indeed, everything is back to the same. And of course, we can also do that while we are already playing the game. So let's just do this a couple of times. And now when I click again, this message should go to what it was. This should go back to 20, and it should also empty this field. So you see, that's exactly what happened. Great. So that was hopefully a lot of fun for you. And even if you did not manage to do all of it on your own, it was still important that you tried to do some of this, because it actually was kind of just repeating or reinforcing the stuff that we already did before. And hopefully you didn't just copy all of it like I just did, because as you're learning, the best thing to do is to really type all the code on your own, because that will then make it stuck in your brain. So in your muscle memory, so to say. Okay. Anyway, now in the next video, we will then finally implement this high score functionality here. And with that, we will then have our game completed.